There is a certain kind of person who will endure your worst behavior, forgive things that most people would never accept, and continue loving you through pain that would cause others to walk away immediately. The frightening part is that you usually do not realize what you had until you are left facing the silence where they once stood. Most people believe the dangerous individuals are the loud ones, the people who argue constantly, make threats, manipulate situations, or create endless drama. But psychology suggests something very different. The strongest people in relationships are rarely the loudest voices in the room. More often, they are the people paying the closest attention. When you spend years being deeply aware of the people around you, noticing emotional patterns that most people overlook, reading between the lines of every conversation, and sensing things that others miss, you develop a level of psychological insight that is difficult for most people to understand. And when that insight finally turns inward, it becomes something no one expected. This is about what happens inside the mind of a person who feels things deeply. It is about what happens when they finally stop giving that emotional energy to someone who never truly appreciated it. And it is about why the people who underestimate that kind of emotional intelligence often end up regretting it more than they ever imagined. Pay close attention because most people only understand this lesson after it is already too late to change anything. The first thing you must understand is that highly sensitive people are not emotional simply because they feel more. They are emotional because they process more. There is a major difference between the two. Feeling and processing are not the same thing. Most people experience an emotion and react to it. Deeply sensitive people experience an emotion, examine it, trace it to its source, compare it to previous experiences, assign meaning to it, and then choose how to respond. That entire process can happen in a matter of seconds, often without conscious effort. What this means is that while you are speaking, they are absorbing far more than your words. They notice your tone, your choice of language, your eye contact, your timing, what you avoid saying, what you repeat, what you whisper, and what you emphasize. They are not simply listening, they're building a real-time understanding of your emotional condition. Most people never realize this is happening, and many of the people who would feel uncomfortable knowing this are usually the same people whose actions and words do not match. That gap between what someone says and what someone does is something highly perceptive people notice almost immediately. They may not point it out right away. They tend to be patient. They usually offer understanding and give people the benefit of the doubt. They search for alternative explanations before assuming the worst. But they remember every inconsistency. They remember every contradiction and every moment when the story changes just enough to raise questions. Over time, those observations form a complete picture. Not a picture built on assumptions, but one built on evidence gathered quietly while everyone else assumes they accepted everything they were told. That is why emotional intelligence at its highest level is not simply kindness, it is precision. It is a deep and often automatic awareness of human behavior. People who dismiss this awareness as being overly sensitive usually do so because accurate observation becomes uncomfortable when their actions cannot withstand close examination. Now, here is the part many people struggle to hear. Deeply perceptive individuals often remain in painful situations much longer than they should. Not because they are weak, and not because they have no alternatives. They stay because they are naturally driven to find meaning behind behavior. When most people encounter a painful pattern in someone they love, they ask, "What does this mean about our relationship?" Sensitive people often ask something different. They ask, "What pain is causing this behavior?" That single difference changes everything. Suddenly, the hurtful behavior no longer feels like a reason to leave. Instead, it becomes something to understand, a wound to heal, a broken part of someone they care about. They continue believing in that person even after that person has stopped believing in themselves. This is both the most beautiful and most dangerous trait they possess. Because eventually you cannot keep pouring meaning into something forever without facing the reality of what it truly is. Think about someone you know, perhaps even yourself, who remained in a painful situation far beyond what seemed logical. Not because they lacked intelligence, and not because they lacked self-respect. They stayed because they were searching for the version of that person they believed still existed beneath all the damage. They refused to give up on the potential they saw, even when reality repeatedly contradicted it. That experience, that unique form of emotional exhaustion, is something deeply perceptive people know very well. Most have lived through it more than once before they learn an important lesson. Eventually, there comes a moment. It is rarely dramatic. It is rarely loud. Most people on the outside never notice it. But something changes within them. Not something that breaks, something that shifts. The psychology behind this moment matters more than most people realize. Human beings can tolerate an extraordinary amount of pain. What they struggle to tolerate is meaninglessness. Pain connected to growth can be endured. Pain connected to purpose can be survived. Pain that feels like part of a meaningful journey can continue for years. But pain that endlessly repeats itself, pain that goes nowhere, pain that exists because someone has mistaken your patience for permanent availability, eventually reaches a limit. When highly aware people reach that limit, they do not usually respond with anger. They do not seek revenge. They do not even respond with sadness in the way people expect. They respond with clarity. And clarity inside a person who already understands human behavior at a deep level is one of the most powerful changes that can happen inside a relationship. Because the moment they stop viewing your behavior through hope and begin viewing it through patterns, everything changes. They are no longer asking what your actions mean. They already know. In many cases, they have known for a long time. The difference is that they stop pretending they do not see it. Most people reach that realization and react with emotional outbursts. They argue. They send long messages. They demand answers. But emotionally intelligent people often become quiet because they have already completed that process internally. They have already worked through the grief, the disappointment, and the slow realization of what was truly happening beneath everything they once interpreted as love. By the time they become silent on the outside, they have often already moved through much of the emotional pain on the inside. This internal processing is why people are often shocked when these relationships end. They say the same things every time. They say, "I never expected this." They say, "Everything seemed normal." They say, "They looked happy." They say, "They never told me anything was wrong." But that is exactly the misunderstanding. They did tell you, not through one dramatic conversation, but through countless small signals. They told you through subtle changes in their responses. They told you when they stopped reaching out first. They told you when their messages became shorter. They told you when they stopped sharing the little details of their day, the observations, the thoughts, and the things they once shared naturally. They communicated their pain in hundreds of small and quiet ways that together formed a complete message. The problem is not that they failed to communicate. The problem is that many people never learned how to recognize that kind of communication. And here is the part that surprises most people. While others interpreted the silence as comfort or contentment, the sensitive person was preparing. Not preparing revenge and not planning anything harmful. They were gradually withdrawing the emotional energy they had invested for so long. Every deeply perceptive person has a limit to their emotional investment. It is not endless. It only appears endless because they give so freely and consistently that people begin treating it like a permanent part of life, like gravity, like the air around them, something that will always exist no matter how it is treated. But it is not permanent. It is a choice that is made every day, a choice renewed through honesty, respect, appreciation, and evidence that their effort matters. When that evidence disappears for long enough, the choice eventually stops being renewed. This is what makes the ending of these relationships so confusing for the people left behind. They are not losing someone who suddenly decided to leave. They are losing someone who emotionally left long before the final goodbye happened. The physical departure is merely the visible part. The real departure occurred in dozens of unnoticed moments that were ignored, dismissed, or never recognized at all. By the time the relationship officially ends, the deeply aware person has already mourned the loss. They have already processed the pain. They have already rebuilt something inside themselves that no longer depends on the relationship for survival. That is why they often appear calm. That is why their peace is mistaken for coldness. People expect them to fall apart, and when they do not, it feels confusing. But they are not cold. They are not heartless. They are not indifferent. What you are seeing is the result of someone who spent months or even years doing the emotional work before anyone realized it was happening. What looks like distance is often healing. What looks like detachment is often acceptance. And what looks like moving on quickly is usually the final stage of a process that began long before anyone noticed the first signs. The truth is simple. The people who feel the deepest are often the people who leave the quietest. They do not leave because they stopped caring. They leave because caring was no longer enough to keep carrying something that only one person was trying to sustain. And once they finally accept that reality, they become almost impossible to pull back into the same cycle again. That is why the silence they leave behind feels so powerful. It is not the absence of noise, it is the absence of someone who spent years bringing understanding, patience, empathy, and emotional depth into a relationship. And once that presence is gone, many people finally realize just how much it was holding together. Unfortunately, by that point, the realization often arrives after the opportunity to change has already disappeared. They are already free, and that freedom to someone who expected them to need the relationship can seem completely confusing. Now let's talk about what actually happens to the person who caused the damage, because this is the part people underestimate the most. For a while, usually a short period, there is relief, especially for people who were emotionally immature in the relationship. People who used the deeply perceptive person's patience as a resource. People who made emotional mistakes and then relied on the other person's capacity for understanding to avoid facing real consequences. When the relationship ends, the first feeling is often something close to relief. The accountability is gone. The awareness is gone. The person who always noticed so much, who always understood too deeply, who always saw beyond the surface story is gone. That awareness, while comforting in many ways, can feel overwhelming to someone who is not ready to be fully known. So there is relief for a moment, and then something begins happening that almost nobody talks about openly. The patterns do not disappear simply because the person who reflected them back is gone. Deeply perceptive people do not just provide emotional support. They provide a kind of psychological mirror. In their presence, people are seen. Their contradictions are gently revealed. Their wounds are acknowledged. Their patterns are reflected back to them through the quality of attention they receive. Most people do not realize how much that mirror was helping until it disappears. And when it is gone, two things happen at the same time. First, the behavior patterns that the perceptive person was quietly absorbing and softening now have nothing to cushion them. The emotional immaturity, the inconsistency, the avoidance, all of it continues unchecked into new relationships, new friendships, and new environments, and people begin noticing. Not with the patience and understanding the previous person offered, but with immediate reactions, conflict, and distance. The world without that steady and understanding presence suddenly feels much harsher and much less forgiving. Second, and this is the part that creates a lasting impact, the perceptive person takes all of that depth with them. They take the specific quality of attention they offered. They take the kind of listening most people have never experienced anywhere else. They take the emotional safety that made vulnerability feel possible. And here is the truth that hits people with a particular sharpness when they finally allow themselves to feel it fully. That depth cannot be duplicated. Not because nobody else is capable of it in theory, but because what was built inside that specific relationship, that specific accumulated understanding of who you are underneath every version of yourself you show the world, does not exist anywhere else. It has to be rebuilt from the beginning, and that rebuilding takes years. Sometimes people search for it in person after person, relationship after relationship, and never find that exact combination again. This is not about punishment. This is not the universe balancing some cosmic score. It is simply the natural consequence of failing to recognize the value of something rare while you still had daily access to it. People notice oxygen when they cannot breathe. They notice emotional depth when they find themselves drowning in the shallow waters of connections built on performance, convenience, or mutual distraction. For some people, that realization arrives early enough to create genuine change. For others, it comes years later in a quiet moment, sitting somewhere ordinary, remembering, feeling the specific shape of something they cannot quite name, but knowing exactly what its absence has cost them. This is the format I'll use for the entire script. Full paragraphs, same style, same length, only slight word changes.